Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukraine war. We start out in the north where fighting continues in the direction of Incursions. The Russians are trying to gain a foothold and properly push through the northern parts of Incursions before moving on to the southern parts, but so far it has reached a stalemate as the Russians are struggling to get a foothold, with heavy artillery and drone battles taking place between the Russians and the Ukrainians in the section of the front. Moving on, we have here in the direction of the west of Kreminna, the Russians have advanced slightly here in the direction of Terny, getting closer to the town, and we see that the Russians have been slowly inching towards Terny, and they're now reaching the ends of the forest lines here to the northeast. With this, we're likely going to see further advances here in the south before the Russians start storming the village, both from the northern and southern forest lines here to the east of the village. The fighting here is connected to a series of fights that's taking place from the west of Kreminna towards the villages of Torske, Yampolivka, and Terny. The front line is close to all of these villages as the Russians are looking to likely storm them all at the same time, to prevent themselves from concentrating their forces in just one area, which would allow the Ukrainians to simply concentrate all of their fire in that one area. Instead, by attacking all at the same time, they would be in a position where the Ukrainians would also have to split their artillery in all of these areas, and it could potentially allow them to gain an advantage when it comes to the section of this front line. There's also the addition that when the Russians only had the Torske part under their control, it would be clear that the Russians would attack in this direction. Now that they have both the eastern parts of Torske, Yampolivka, and Terny under their control, they could attack in any one of those villages separately or them all at the same time. This makes it so that it's more difficult for the Ukrainians to find out or figure out where the Russians would attack beforehand. Therefore, there are several advantages to the Russians expanding their zone of control before launching any sort of offensive operations. It is also possible that the Russians will look to close out this gap here in between Terny and Klishchiivka. However, I find that less likely, as unlike the east of Yampolivka and Terny, there's not heavy forest areas here in between Terny and Klishchiivka, so it's less likely for the Russians to have an interest in fighting through these open fields prior to launching an offensive operation, but they could simply move through the southern parts and in a northern direction and combining it with an assault from the east once the time is right. Moving on further south, we see that fighting continues both in the direction of Belorivka, here to the northeast of Siversk, in the direction of the Ivanivske town, here to the southwest of Bakhmut, restarted operations towards Klishchiivka, all of this, and with the direction of Berdychi also continuous fighting. We see that the main fighting of the Russians is here towards the west of Bakhmut, where they're looking to capture Klishchiivka, Ivanivske, and Berdychi, allowing them to reach the canal line, which is heavily fortified by the Ukrainians and is a natural barrier in and of itself. Then we have the northern parts where there was some positional fighting, but there's no active part of this front right now, with the active part being here by Belorivka, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the Donetsk region here in this section. Moving on, we see here further south in the direction of the Donetsk region. We see that positional fighting continues in the villages of Berdychi, Orlivka, and Tonenke. And we just received reports from the direction of Berdychi, where the Russians have managed to reach the western parts of the village. However, it is based on a video from the 47th Mechanized Brigade on the Ukrainian side defending the village, and from it we see the destruction of a Russian armored personnel carrier here in the western parts. With this, we can see that it is likely that the Russians have further control over some of the eastern parts, but not really all the way up to the western parts. Until further confirmation arrives, I'm leaving the majority of the village in a gray zone until there's more clarification. But so far, there's an indication that the Russians have, or there's evidence that the Russians have reached the western parts of the village, which means that the majority of the village is under Russian control. In the meantime, slightly further south, we see the Russians have made another advancement within Pervomaiske as they're getting closer with reaching the two tips here to the north and east of Pervomaiske. We're seeing that the Russians are looking to push through these central parts while holding on to the northern parts, allowing them to connect both of these and push the Ukrainians out by forcing them to move through the more open areas rather than the residential areas by pushing them further south. As long as the Ukrainians are looking to avoid fighting, they'll be looking through the southern parts, or they could be focusing on counterattacking the Russian positions here, but that would leave them vulnerable behind. And this may be why the Russians have been advancing here to the east, due to the vulnerability of the Ukrainians here in the eastern parts of Berdychi. So far, it seems to be a complete recap, and it's just the same thing happening as when the Russians were taking the eastern parts of Pervomaiske. The exact same happened. The Russians attacked the flank, and now the Russians are moving through the central parts due to that flanking maneuver. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians did not really learn from the last time they were fighting a couple of months back, and the same thing happened again. Moving further south, we see here in the direction of Krasnoyarivka there has been some developments. The Ukrainians managed to push the Russians slightly back and recapture the fortifications here to the south of Krasnoyarivka, and the Russians slightly expanded their control over the southernmost road here in the southern parts of Krasnoyarivka. And with this, we see positional fightings continue here in the southern parts of Krasnoyarivka. The lack of Russian advances allowed the Ukrainians to take advantage of that, preventing the Russians from consolidating their gains and leaving them in a position where they only hold the southernmost road of Krasnoyarivka. With this, we see that it is likely that the Ukrainians will either continue counterattacking and regain all of the positions within the city itself, or simply that fighting will continue and spread in a western direction, as Russians are looking to gain control over these southern parts of Krasnoyarivka to secure a foothold and gain access to resupply through the main road here to the southeast. But there's also the possibility of them trying to expand where the supplies can go through. The main reason for that is having only one supply route is very difficult, because the Ukrainians can simply constantly bombard it and survey it, seeing all of the reinforcements where they're coming from and how they are going to get there, etc., making it very difficult for the Russians to hold on to the position even with supplies. But if they have several supply routes, then it's much easier for them to continue holding on to the southern parts and allow them to gain the advantage in the Battle of Krasnoyarivka. Moving on further south, we see fighting continues here in the direction of RUAF, here to the south of Krasnoyarivka, direction of Pobieda, positional both in the northern and western directions, direction of Novomikhailivka close to the north and to the south of the town, and then further south in by Shevchenkove, the Russians recaptured some positions from probing attacks, but there's no active part here in the section of the front, all the way from Shevchenkove and down to Robotyne, where fighting continues both to the east and to the southwest of the village, as the Russians are looking to gain further access and capture the Ukrainian fortifications here by Robotyne. The next point we have to cover is the continuous propaganda PR attacks by the Free Russia Army into Russian territory that then was exposed to be outside of Russian territory. We have this geolocated footage here, which shows the Free Russia Legion claiming they were inside the village of Tetkino on the other side of the border, was in reality inside the village of Klishchiivka here at the Ukrainian side of the border. This was confirmed because they were taking the selfie next to this very discernible building, which the Russians had also taken pictures of prior at the very start of the invasion when they crossed over into the Sumy region. And with this, we see that the Free Russia Legion never really got into the village of Tetkino. Instead, we are seeing this footage here, where we see these Free Russia Legion guys going through the border, trying to gain a foothold across. They have an infantry group running in and across the border, occupying the buildings by the border crossing, and a couple of tanks. One of the tanks hits a mine, disabling it, after which it was destroyed by a FPV drone dropping grenades. Then we have heavy bombardment and artillery strikes on all of the buildings, completely leveling them to the ground, likely leaving no survivors due to the heavy shelling and explosions taking place in the area. This mission was an extremely difficult and dangerous one, and it went as about anyone really would have expected when a battalion by itself, or will in this case likely just a squad or company, launching an attack across a border against a nation that has hundreds of thousands of conscripts and other units simply waiting across the border with tanks, artillery, etc., just sitting there waiting for the 100 guys to try and cross over. Compared to last year when the Free Russia Legion did the same thing, this time the Russians are prepared, have prepared strategies, have prepared everything, and they simply just walked into a trap. The fact that they're continuing this with no gains and tons of losses makes zero sense, and there's absolutely no justification for what they're doing other than simply PR, where they're exaggerating what they're actually gaining from it. In the meantime, the Ukrainians have strengthened the building of fortifications here in the Kharkiv region. We see that they're building both trenches, concrete fortifications, dragon teeth, etc., trying to prepare for a possible Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region. We also see this in the Zaporizhia front and other areas of the front here by Ukraine, where they're trying to build up some fortifications last minute before a Russian offensive in the summer. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.